This has been an extraordinary day of animated and vigorous conversation about democracy and its future. Let me begin by addressing the most provocative question that we had from a member of the audience. What's wrong with authoritarianism? Now, what indeed is wrong with authoritarianism? A contrast was being drawn by the questioner between democracy as chaos and authoritarianism representing order. And I immediately thought of what Mahatma Gandhi had said in 1942 on the eve of launching the Quit India movement. In response to a question from a journalist, he said, "This ordered anarchy is worse than real anarchy." And he asked the British to leave India to anarchy or God. We are meeting on the eve of the 100th anniversary of a terrible massacre that took place in Amritsar on the 13th of April, 1919. And underlying the brutality that took place, Reginald Dyer asked his soldiers to open fire on unarmed men, women, and children. According to the official estimate, 379 people were killed, some 1,200 wounded. According to unofficial figures, at least 1,000 people died. And underlying that brutality was what C.F. Andrews had called at that time race insolence. Yesterday, or the day before, Theresa May could not bring herself to apologize for that massacre. Jeremy Corbyn was in favor of an unqualified apology. So the British Parliament, which is quite dysfunctional when it comes to Brexit, did manage to have a short discussion on what had happened 100 years ago. But the reason I raised this matter is that, this kind of race insolence is abroad in many parts of the world. And that, in many ways, threatens the prospects of democracy in the future. This is something that Sylvester brought up in the course of his presentation this morning. Why is Europe so afraid of what they see as the hordes of refugees, coming into the heartland of Europe? So I would want to defend democracy as a normative value that we really ought to aspire for. And I am a bit troubled by suggestions that you can have good governance without democracy. I think a healthy dose of democracy has to be an intrinsic part of anything that we might call good governance. But of course, as Cameron Munter pointed out this morning, we can't apply old tools to solve new problems. We have to fashion new tools to address the problems of today. On the question of media and democracy, I have sort of wondered, what democracies like the United States and India can learn from one another. At one level, I have been very encouraged in the United States in the last couple of years to see that a significant fraction of the mainstream media has played a very critical role. They have actually spoken truth to power. In India, I have found that the bulk of the mainstream media has been intimidated, has been cowed by the forces of majoritarianism. And yet, there is something very troubling about even the critical media that we have in the United States. I find it to be terribly insular. That there is no discussion of a foreign country beyond Russia, and that is limited to Russian interference in the last US election. By contrast, even a cowed media or a media which has limited freedom in India or Pakistan is at least more open to developments in other parts of the world. And that I see as a hopeful sign that we need to learn from each other. The challenges that we face are sometimes comparable, and some of the solutions that we might look for might in fact be drawn from contexts other than our own. I would like to say something about two types of challenges that democracy faces, particularly in the Middle East and South Asia. In my opening remarks this morning, I was rather critical of the strong men, those who have been elected, but who are in some ways authoritarian political leaders. And yet, in conclusion, I also want to point to the dangers that institutional imbalance poses for the future of democracy in South Asia, in the Middle East. And let me make it concrete for you by giving you an example. In Turkey, we have one kind of challenge. Erdogan, democratically elected, but increasingly prone to authoritarianism. And in Egypt, where you have a huge asymmetry of power between the primary unelected institution, the military, and democratic forces of whatever kind. And to my mind, Sisi, in fact, poses a much graver threat to democracy than Erdogan, simply because, there is just a chance, perhaps no more than a chance, that Erdogan might be defeated. We have seen even in the local elections that he has suffered setbacks in Ankara and Istanbul. So perhaps, even a flawed democracy is somewhat, better than a scenario where, the military continues to be the dominant state institution. And as a result, there's a perpetuation of this kind of asymmetry of power. I'd like to pick up on two terms or concepts that were first used by Roger Myerson on the second panel, but then picked up by Cameron Munter in this final panel. The first is, of course, tolerance. And tolerance absolutely has to be a key element of democracy. And we had a very interesting debate in December of 2015 in the Indian Parliament on quote-unquote growing intolerance. And this was in the context of lynchings of Muslims on suspicion of having stored beef. And what I tried to say in that speech was that intolerance is bad, but tolerance is not good enough. That we must aspire for something higher, that in a country as diverse as India, we must try to achieve a level of cultural intimacy among different communities. And tolerance, I think, has a deep history in the history of Islam. I think it's historically quite inaccurate to see Islam as having conquered South Asia, certainly by the sword. And there is a literature that we have both in the Middle East and South Asia, which goes by the name of akhlaq literature. Akhlaq means ethics, and there is a body of political thought which is about akhlaq, and it's about the ethics of good governance. And I raised this matter because one of the people who had been killed was a man called Muhammad Akhlaq, very close to Delhi, in a place called Dadri, on suspicion of having beef in his refrigerator just before Eid. And I basically, called upon the government to subscribe to akhlaq, the ethics of good governance, that is so much a part of our tradition, our political tradition, the history of our own political thought. The Ottoman Empire has been mentioned by both Roger Meyerson and Cameron Munter, and I would also like to mention another empire, the Mughal Empire. And these were pre-colonial empires that knew how to negotiate the challenge of difference, often much better than the modern nation states of today. In some ways, the modern nation states have borrowed from centralized state forms introduced by the colonial empires, the British and the French and the Dutch in the Middle East and South and Southeast Asia. Now, obviously, these pre-colonial empires did not have democracy in the sense of elections or representative government, but they knew how to accommodate difference. And they knew something else. They knew how to have democracy in the sense of government by discussion. Just think of the Mughal Emperor Akbar's court, where representatives from all the different religious communities available in India at that time would come together. And how can we forget that in the 16th century, you could hold high political office in the Mughal Empire if you were a non-Muslim. In fact, the top generals, the top finance ministers, all happened to be non-Muslim. But even in the late 19th century, in Britain, in the United Kingdom, you could not aspire to high political office if you were a Catholic. So, there are certain political traditions going back to the pre-colonial empires that might actually help us in addressing contemporary challenges of democracy. The other term, which is now related to what I've already raised, is federalism. And this was something that has been discussed in both the second and the final panel. Now, this is, of course, again, federalism must be a part of democracy. Democracy makes no sense, particularly in diverse countries, without a very strong element of federalism woven into it. But there are some challenges, given our own colonial history in South Asia and parts of the Middle East. The British colonial government typically wanted to divert Indian political attention towards the localities, towards these safer local pastures, in order to keep power in their own hands at the center. And this is exactly what was done by military dictators in Pakistan in the post-colonial period, when Ayub Khan introduced his basic democracy system, when Zia-ul-Haq introduced local government and so on. But I'm sure that there is a way in which democratically elected governments need not roll back concessions that have been given to localities and local institutions. There is a way to have a layered political system. And I think that in India, this is done quite well in many of the states. There is, of course, parliament at the central level, there are state legislatures, but there are also municipalities in the towns and a three-tiered local government structure in the rural areas. And the way that India has made sure that backbenchers in state legislatures would not stand against local government is that you can be a member of a local government and at the same time be a legislator at the state level or in parliament. Now, you can't be both. You can't be a parliamentarian and a member of a state assembly, but you can actually be in local government. And that's one way in which India has tried to address the problem. And finally, and so I would strongly argue for, a return to a concept of layered and shared sovereignty, which has been, part of India's history and South Asia's history of political thought. But finally, at an assembly which has been convened by the Benazir Bhutto Leadership Program, I wanted to end by talking about gender equity and women's representation in democratic, political systems. And, this has worked relatively well, once again, at the level of local democracy. In most states of India by now, between a third and a half of local representatives are women. They have to be women. And initially there was a tendency to have wives and sisters and daughters of male representatives stand in for women. But over a period of time, the women have empowered themselves. And local panchayats run by women are actually, on balance, performing better than those that have been sort of run by men. But how do we increase the representation of women in the higher echelons of representative government? It's not easy. We in South Asia have had women heads of government, not just in India and Pakistan, but also in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. But the representation of women in the Indian Parliament is very low. In 1996, some 23 years ago, a women's reservation bill had been introduced in Parliament. It is still hanging fire. But there were certain problems with that particular approach to ensuring just representation for women. It would have reserved 1/3 of the seats in Parliament for women, and these constituencies would rotate. So there were two major problems with this approach, which my mother, who was a 3-term member of Parliament, pointed out. First of all, this kind of rotation of reserved constituencies would cut the bond between the representative and the represented. Because if a representative knew that next time around there was going to be a reservation of a male member's constituency for a woman, then there would be no incentive to serve the constituents. But there was a second problem too, because if you reserved constituencies for women in the way that constituencies are reserved for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in India, then you would find that women would be fighting against women within the protected walls of these women's reserved constituencies. And there were many women who felt that that was not going to be a particularly healthy development. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to require recognized and registered political parties to nominate at least 49% men and 49% women on their lists in each state. And that's how, in fact, women's representation has increased across the world. When political parties have nominated more women, in some countries, this has happened voluntarily. In some Indian states, this is already happening voluntarily. And even without the law reserving 1/3 of the seats for women, from certain states, including my own, Bengal, there's more than 1/3 of representation by women. But we cannot rely on simply, voluntary compliance by political parties to this norm. And therefore, it is very easily possible in a country like India to amend the Representation of the People Act to require registered and recognized political parties to have gender parity on their nomination lists. And that would immediately, dramatically increase the representation of women and lead towards gender parity in representation in the highest policy-making bodies of the country. So we have had a wonderful conversation, and thanks again to Class Act HR 73 and the Benazir Bhutto Fellowship Program. I did want to end on a positive note because we were all wanting to be hopeful in the last panel, but I don't want optimism to be triumphing over experience. So I would also introduce a word of caution. In India, elections are underway. They will happen in 7 phases. It began yesterday. The last day of polling will be the 19th of May. At one level, it is truly a great festival of democracy. There are more than 900 million people on the electoral rolls who will get to have their say. But unfortunately, we also have to note that the rhetoric during the campaign, particularly by the ruling party, has become truly toxic. That there is anti-minority vitriol that is being spouted day in and day out. And of course, the same kind of prejudice is something that is being articulated in so many other democracies, including, of course, the United States of America. So if we are truly to restore democracy to good health, those of us who are located in places such as universities must make a concerted attempt to elevate our political discourse to a certain level of respect and dignity. Thank you very much.